Hey everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to Geeksvana. As part of our interview series with Callum Holland from the CAA, we are next going to be discussing visual line of sight, VLOS, and the new AMC rules which were put out by the CAA last week. Now, our video on that topic has created a lot of interest and there's been a lot of comments raised by you, our audience. So I've put some of those comments forward to Callum, as well as seeking first-hand clarification on some of the points. This is an important one. Just before I start this video, could you please hit the subscribe button if you're new, and could my regulars keep that new trend of hitting the like button nice and early? Let's get on with it. Up next is another very much hot topic, especially on the Geeksvana channel, with a very popular video which we put out recently to explain, well, not really to explain actually, but to talk about the AMC and GM in terms of VLOS. So essentially the new CAA rules in terms of, and guidance in terms of how to keep your drone within visual line of sight. There has obviously been a community reaction to this, which has been interesting and on a number of levels. And there seems to have been a bit of a shock impact, certainly suggesting that there might already be actually some levels of non-compliance with VLOS, full stop. But also the orientation thing, visual orientation thing, seems to have thrown a few people off, as it were. What are your thoughts in terms of the new VLOS guidance and how people should be complying with it?
Yeah, this one's really interesting actually, and I'll hold my hands up. This one actually caught me a bit off guard in terms of the community response. I like to consider myself, firstly a member of the community, having still doing recreational activity, having previously done commercial activity in the past prior to joining the CAA, and I think the response it didn't catch me off guard. Maintaining visual line of sight with the drone, in my eyes, has always been a matter of being able to view and control its orientation at any point in space, at any point in time, when conducting the operation. I've read a lot of sort of comments online around, well, I can just look down at my GCS and that will tell me what way I'm pointing. And if everything's going well, that's absolutely fine. But there's lots of challenges with the GCS. If you've flown UAS long enough, GCSs fail, and they don't necessarily completely fail, so where you don't have control of the RPAS, but the screen might go off. Lots of people are bolting their mobile phones to use as a screen. You can get a phone call, your phone can run out of battery. Lots of things can happen there that prevent you being able to look down and determine the orientation of the drone when compared to the pilot. So that doesn't always help. That's not 100% mitigation. The other point is, this is visual. If you're looking down at a controller, that's not visual. The other point that I read is, well, below 400 feet, uncontrolled airspace, it's very safe airspace. And I've always considered uncontrolled airspace, Class G below 400 feet, to be some of the riskiest airspace in terms of my own perception of where I'm operating. I was always much more comfortable flying in controlled airspace within an FRZ with permission from the air traffic controller, because it was a known quantity. I knew what was around me. Everybody else knew that I was there. When we're flying below 400 feet in uncontrolled airspace, first of all, with exemptions to SARA, we can have general aviation aircraft take off and land from any unlicensed aerodrome. And that can just be something as simple as a fart strip. So you don't necessarily know that aircraft is going to be there, or when it's going to be there, or what it's going to do. But if it's landing and taking off, it's going to be below 400 feet. They don't have to be electronically conspicuous. We've got a really wide, low-level military flying network in the UK. And we have, an incredible emergency services that make use of things like HEMS, that use uncontrolled Class G airspace below 400 feet on occasion to respond to emergency incidents. So the idea that if you're operating in uncontrolled airspace below 400 feet, that somehow that's safe, and that we can get away with just maintaining VLOS by looking on a screen, it's an alien concept to me. So, addressing that, we've released a bit more guidance on, well, this isn't just a sort of a 500 meter thing here. This is, can you see the aircraft? Can you see its orientation? And if your GCS was to fail, as long as you still had control of the platform, could you bring it back without having to do a bit of a dance in the air by sort of yawing left, yawing right, trying to see the light, red right, green left, whatever it is, and trying to work out the orientation then? Because if you're reacting in an emergency situation to perhaps an airspace infringement, you've got to know how to control that aircraft and bring it back to the safest place possible without having to think about it.
Okay, so when we talk about sort of the visually determining the aircraft orientation, we are talking about I with my naked eye, or obviously I wear prescription glasses. I need to be able to see that is the back of my Mini 3 or Air 2S or whatever I'm for, Inspire, and that's it essentially. So tweaking the controls, yawing, that type of thing for me to work out it isn't acceptable under the AMC. It actually you do need to visually be able to see the aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely. And the build on it was that previously we had this 500 meters, and what we found is people were using that as a bit like some people use the speed limit.
Yes.
It's 70 miles an hour, I can do 70 safely. That's not the case. There's lots of situations on the UK roads where it might be a national speed limit, but it's unsafe in certain circumstances, around certain corners, around certain times of the day, to do that speed limit. And taking a Mavic Mini to 500 meters, I mean, that's not even EVLOS. You're truly BVLOS at that point. You cannot see that aircraft at 500 meters. So it's a recognition of that. And I think removing that 500 meter, that arbitrary number, will help operators and users of UAS and other sort of platforms to think a bit more around VLOS and go, actually, VLOS isn't 500 meters. It's I can actually take command and control this platform should my GCS fail, and know where it is and which way it's pointing and what it's doing.
Okay. And in terms of the AMC and GM and the VLOS guidance within it, how does that fit in terms of the legislation and enforcement? Because obviously we have the AMC, which is by the very definition the acceptable means of compliance, which is put in place by the CAA to enable us to have the presumption that we are flying legally, essentially, by following that means of compliance. But the legislation itself is obviously a little bit more vague, but in terms of enforcement, in terms of the real world flying out there, etc., which is the one which is going to be enforced? Is it the AMC, or and where would that enforcement come into it?
So I'm afraid it's perhaps not as black and white as it would first appear.
Yes.
The document that I'm currently sharing on the screen, it gives an idea of where sort of regulation, policy, acceptable means of compliance, guidance material, and caps sit within sort of the hierarchy. We have something called primary and secondary legislation. And what we're talking about when we say primary legislation is things like the basic regulation. And when we say secondary regulation, we're talking about things like the implementing and delegated reg. And that isn't unique to aviation legislation. Primary and secondary regulation is something that's known sort of across the breadth of sort of the legislative framework. Now, what we have that falls off the back of secondary regulations, so all of that's law. Primary and secondary regulation is law. That's gone through sort of due process. What we have that falls off the back of the secondary regulation is interpretation. Now, most laws, not just aviation laws, are open to a degree of sort of interpretation, and there's a couple of ways that we can do that interpretation in the UK. One of them is you can consult Hansard. So when MPs are debating a particular piece of regulation in the House of Commons, they'll have conversations about it, right? And you can get a flavour from what they're saying as to their intention within that piece of law. Another way you can do it is through the judicial process. So if it's the first time that particular piece of law has been challenged in the courts, or somebody's been charged with committing a particular offence, the judge will make an interpretation of the law. And that happens across the breadth of legislation, that this isn't just aviation specific. So what we do as the regulator is we create acceptable means of compliance and guidance material that provides an interpretation on the law and what we would consider acceptable and compliant against the law to aid our operators. Now, clearly, if and this is very circumstance dependent, so I don't want to get into
no, indeed,
this, then that, because we could be here all day talking about different situations. First of all, the front line of enforcement of the regulation is the police. So if they were, and I'll give an example, if they were to come across an operator that was flying a drone beyond what they would consider reasonable to maintain visual line of sight, and they didn't have a beyond visual line of sight approval, so let's say an open category pilot, they would then have to make a decision in consultation with perhaps the Crown Prosecution Service on whether or not what they witnessed and the evidence they captured was sufficient to suggest that that remote pilot couldn't have possibly have been maintaining visual line of sight with the drone. And that's not an exact science, right?
Yes,
it depends on where it is, what the weather's like, what time of day it is, what drone's being flown, how big it is, the visual acuity of the remote pilot. There's lots of decisions and factors that go into making that assessment. So I'm afraid it's not an exact science. The acceptable means of compliance and guidance material is exactly what it says on the tin, actually. It's what the CAA would deem acceptable, and it's a bit of guidance as well to try and help people, because legislation is written in a very particular way, and perhaps for lots of people, myself included, I prefer a degree of kind of guidance provided by an expert organisation such as the CAA to help me understand that piece of regulation, and that's really what it's there for.
Okay, and of course, as the airspace regulator, you are appointed by government to do just that, to provide the framework to help us keep the skies safe, etc. And therefore, this kind of guidance is there. So, in terms of VLOS specifically, but also the AMC and GM in general, this is effectively policy and guidance. But it is policy guidance from the airspace regulator, which then allows you to be comfortable and to know that you are that you are complying to the regulation and legislation to the point where the air regulator is happy with that. Essentially, if I follow the AMC, then there is, as it states, there is that presumption that you are following the law. If I decide not to follow that, then it is basically down to me standing in court and proving, or going through that. Again, we won't speak about the legal processes because they can be complicated.
Yeah, an example being, the regulation, the implementing regulation says VLOS, visual line of sight. It is then open up to a degree of interpretation of what VLOS means. Now, the CAA have stated their position on what would be accepted as visual line of sight within the AMC and GM. Now, if somebody was to, have a different definition of visual line of sight, and they were to be charged with an offence of, or whatever the offence might be, it could be offence against the air navigation order, endangering another aircraft, perhaps, if you're flying so far beyond the visual line of sight of yourself, the remote pilot, that perhaps you're, creating a danger to other air users. That's going to be something that's going to be interpreted at the courts, right? I would imagine. They're going to look at what the CAA position was. They're going to look at the law, and they're going to make a reasonable assessment on, with all the facts in front of them, actually what is visual line of sight. And then what happens, and this is, again, broad legislatively speaking, not specific to aviation, you'll have a stated case. So a bit boring. I won't go into the weeds because I don't want people tuning out of your channel. But what would happen if that was challenged at court? The judge would make an assessment, and then there would be what we call a stated case, and then that would become sort of the de facto standard of what would be considered in this circumstance VLOS.
Yes, indeed, and which again, the fact that we don't have those definitions shows that there aren't police officers hiding in the hedges trying to catch people going slightly out of line of sight with their mini threes, etc. The definitions laid out in the AMC and GM and the guidance in the GM is really to make it categorically clear that if you cannot see your drone, then you are breaking the law. Actually, if you would like guidance in terms of how to comply with that law, this is the guidance that we, as the airspace regulator, in conjunction with all the other experts that we collaborate with, this is the guidance that we recommend you follow. but it isn't the case of, we don't want you to enjoy the hobby, we don't want you to enjoy your drone flights. It is more, as far as I'm concerned, an attempt to stop that sort of ambiguity that the 500 meters used to give, where of course a Mini 3 cannot be seen at 500 meters without strobes and without moving. Well, I would question whether you could see it at all at 500 meters, but I'm not going to question people's eyesight. But the ambiguity is gone from the point of view of in the AMC, from saying that you need to visually see the aircraft orientation, which makes it much clearer. And that helps in terms of people being able to follow the guidelines, because of course the AMC isn't necessarily about trying to catch people and trying to prosecute people. It's about trying to create a safe airspace.
It's to help people. And me as a recreational pilot, that's how I see it. It's an aid for me. I use it to help guide me in terms of when I have sort of a question on a particular area of law, I can review the AMC GM and then be confident that what I'm doing is safe. So there's a couple of things here. This isn't just about protecting, first of all, other air users. Uncontrolled airspace below 400 feet is potentially very busy. It's certainly not as quiet as some people suggest. Yes, I understand that there's certain areas, especially in the Highlands of Scotland, that you could say is a quiet volume of airspace. But there's lots of circumstances, across the UK where Class G uncontrolled is very busy. So first of all, it's to protect other air users. And as a regulator, we've got to take into consideration lots and lots of things beyond what would be immediately obvious to perhaps just somebody that wants to go and fly their Mavic 2 or whatever it is in the park on a Sunday afternoon. There's lots of additional considerations we have to have that form part of our decision-making process. So where perhaps on face value it might not be immediately obvious how we've sort of come to that conclusion, there's a lot of thought that's gone into that decision. So it's to protect other airspace users. It's also to protect members of the public. That's another important topic here, because if you lose control of your drone and it clips a tree or something like that in the park, you're potentially going to hurt people. And what I would take from it as a recreational operator is it's there to protect you as well. It's there to try and prevent you perhaps getting yourself into an uncomfortable situation that you don't want to be in. So this certainly isn't a case of trying to ruin the hobby, far from it. As I've said earlier on in today's video, we want to enable the hobby. The hobby is the grassroots where most of our sort of operators and pilots come from. What we want to do is make sure it's safe. And as the hobby becomes more popular and more people are getting involved in it, and as our airspace gets busier, which it is generally speaking, clearly we're going to have to provide additional protections for those three demographics that I've just talked about. And that is just a sort of the reality of it.
In terms of the actual the VLOS guidance and that one sort of shock point in terms of how the community feel, needing to have the being able to visually determine an aircraft's orientation. Why is that deemed necessary? Because of course we are therefore then talking about keeping something like a Mini 3, which of course is sub 250 gram drones rather than being brand specific, very close to you, for someone with my eyesight, my age, etc. On a winter's day that's a little bit smoggy, etc. I'm probably going to have to keep that drone within 110 meters of myself to be 100% compliant. Where is the evidence? Where is the information that tells you that is less safe than me flying it further where I can still see the drone, but actually just twitch the controls so that the yaw can tell me which way it is, etc. Where's that sort of data?
Yeah, absolutely. So we clearly, as the airspace regulator, get our hands on lots of reports that have been filed, not just by sort of the regulated community, but the wider aviation community. Fundamentally, when we're talking about maintaining VLOS, and you're absolutely right, I think I'm probably at about 80 to 90 meters for my Mini, and my eyesight's pretty good. The challenge with kind of the yaw, and that's kind of what we used to do, right? I remember when I was sort of 13, 14, you'd give it a bit of a wiggle and see which way it goes. At about 100 meters, or beyond that, sorry, you're going to struggle to determine the yaw orientation as well by giving it a wiggle. Now, what people might say is, and we're getting into a bit of the nerdy stuff here, but we like that, you might go, right, what I'm going to do is push the right stick left and see which way it goes. If it goes right, then it's pointed towards me. If it goes left, then it's the right orientation, right? You might do that. There becomes a distance. I've certainly had this happen to me, when I was very young, where you can get yourself in a bit of a situation where you test, and perhaps it doesn't go the way that you expected it to go. So you test again, and actually it goes a bit further. And it's almost like a cascade effect, where you get yourself into a point where, my goodness, it's now twice the distance away, and I have absolutely no clue whatsoever. So if you're finding yourself in a position where you're having to go, ooh, I need to check which orientation my platform's in, our suggestion is, well, you've probably already gone too far at that point.
Okay.
For the entire length of the flight. And people will say, oh, but now I can only fly my many 100 meters away. Yeah. The airspace around us is congested. We need to protect other airspace users. We need to protect people on the ground, and we need to protect you as an operator. And yes, so if you would like to fly further away, then perhaps you might need a bigger platform and flying perhaps the A3 subcategory. And that's the reality of the regulation and the AMC and GM.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for a really clear answer on that. I do appreciate it.